Okay, last we forget. This is from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules from Life. This is rule number 11, don't bother kids while they're skateboarding. I apologize about the loud music in the background. I live in a Section 8 apartment complex with a bunch of ghetto people. They really dislike people reading. And so even though like my reading, it's not very loud, if they can hear somebody reading, they're willing to turn up their movie to the full blast just to try to disturb me. So that's a characteristic of unsuccessful people. They're worried about what everybody else is doing. And successful people are worrying about bettering themselves. So I do apologize about the background noise. Least we forget, ideas have consequences. When the communists established the Soviet Union after the First World War, people could be forgiven for hoping that the utopian collectivist dreams their new leaders purveyed were possible. The decayed social order of the late 19th century produced the trenches and mass slaughters of the Great War. It's World War I he's referring to. The gap between rich and poor was extreme, and most people slaved away in conditions worse than later described by Orwell. Although the West received word of the horror perpetuated by Lenin after the Russian Revolution, it remained difficult to evaluate his actions from afar. Russia was in post-monarchical chaos, and the news of widespread industrial development and redistribution of property to those who had recently been serfs provided reason for hope. To complicate things further, the USSR and Mexico supported the Democratic Republicans when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936. They were fighting against the essentially fascist nationalists who had overthrown the fragile democracy established over 5 years previously and who found support with the Nazis and Italian fascists. Yeah, I said I pronounced it Nazis just for fun. I won't do that again. The intelligentsia in America, Great Britain, and elsewhere were severely frustrated by their home country's neutrality. Thousands of foreigners streamed into Spain to fight for the Republicans, serving in the international brigades. George Orwell was one of them. Ernest Hemingway served there as a journalist and was a supporter of the Republicans. Politically concerned young Americans, Canadians, and Brits felt a moral obligation to stop talking and started fighting. All of this drew attention away from the co-current events in the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Stalinist Soviets sent 2 million kulaks, their richest peasants, to Siberia. Those with a small number of cows, a couple of hired hands, or a few acres more than was typical. From the communist viewpoint, these kulaks had gathered their wealth by plundering those around them and deserved their fate. Wealth signified oppression, and private property was theft. It was time for some equity. More than 30,000 kulaks were shot on the spot. Many more met their fate at the hands of the more jealous, resentful, and unproductive neighbors who used the high ideals of communist collectivism to mask their murderous intent. So like I said, there's a lot of bad people in the world. Actually, I said that on my Brant Rants channel. There's a lot of bad people in this world. You gotta be careful. You gotta get a gun. I take that back. I'm actually for gun control. Everybody else except me. The kulaks were enemies of the people, apes, scum, vermin, filth, and swine. We will make soap out of the kulaks, claimed one particularly brutal cadre of city dwellers. Mobilized by party and Soviets and Soviet executive committees and sent out into the countryside, the kulaks were driven naked into the streets, beaten, and forced to dig their own graves. The women were raped, their belongings were expropriated, which, in practice, meant that their houses were stripped to the rafters and ceiling beams and everything was stolen. In many places, the non-kulak peasants resisted, particularly the women, who took to surrounding the persecuted families with their bodies. This is horrible that this happened in Russia, and this was the start of communism. You know, I'm not going to say anything about Russia, but, you know, the World Cup is there right now. But Vladimir Putin's probably the richest person in the world in 2018. And just an analytical, objective fact is Russia leads the world in atheism and abortion. Two categories that I wouldn't want to be proud of being number one in. All right. Such resistance proved futile. The kulaks who didn't die were exiled to Siberia, often in the middle of the night. The train started in February in the bitter Russian cold. Everybody here how cold Siberia is. Housing of the most substandard kind awaited them upon their arrival at the desert taiga. Many died, particularly children, from typhoid, measles, and scarlet fever. The parasitical kulaks were, in general, the most skillful and hard-working farmers. What were their crime? They had a little money saved. A small minority of people are responsible for most of the production of any field, and farming proved no different. Agricultural output crashed. What little remained was taken by force out of the countryside and into the cities. Rural people who went out into the fields after the harvest to glean single grains of wheat for their hungry families risked execution. 6 million people died of starvation in the Ukraine. That's like the worst way to die, too. The breadbasket of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. To eat your own children is a barbarian act, declared posters of the Soviet regime. Wow. To eat your own children is a barbarian act. Despite more than mere rumors of such atrocities, attitudes towards communism remain consistently positive among many Western intellectuals. There were other things to worry about. In the Second World War, allied the Soviet Union under the Western countries opposing Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito. Certain watchful eyes remained open nonetheless. Malcolm Muggeridge published a series of articles describing Soviet demolition of the peasantry as early as 1933 for the Manchester Guardian. George Orwell understood what was going on under Stalin, and he made it widely known. He published Animal Farm, a fable satirizing the Soviet Union in 1945, despite encountering serious resistance to the book's release. Many should have known better and retained their blindness for long after this. Nowhere was this truer than France, and nowhere truer in France than among the intellectuals. It's strange. Russia helped end World War II by defeating Nazi Germany, but at the same time, they were terrible oppressors themselves. So. France's most famous mid-century philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, was a well-known communist, although not a card carrier, until he denounced the Soviet incursion into Hungary in 1956. He remained an advocate for Marxism nonetheless, and did not finally break with the Soviet Union until 1968, when the Soviets violently suppressed the Czechoslovakians during the Prague Spring. Not long after came the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which we have discussed rather extensively in previous chapters. As noted, and is worth noting again, this book utterly demolished communism's moral credibility, first in the West and then in the Soviet system itself. It circulated in underground samizdat format. Russians had 24 hours to read their rare copy before handing it to the next waiting mind. A Russian language reading was broadcast into the Soviet Union by Radio Liberty. Stoyanevsky argued that the Soviet system could have never survived without tyranny and slave labor, that the seeds of its worst excesses were definitely sowed in the time of Lenin, for whom the Western communists still served as apologists, and that it was propelled by the endless lies, both individual and public. Its sins could not be blamed on the simple cult of personality, as its supporters continued to claim. Stolinsky documented the Soviet Union's extensive mistreatment of political prisoners, its corrupt legal system, and its mass murderers, and showed in painstaking detail how these were not aberrations but direct expressions of the underlying communist philosophy. No one could stand up for communism after the Gulag Archipelago, not even the communists themselves. This did not mean that the fascination Marxist ideas had for intellectuals, particularly French intellectuals, disappeared. It mainly transformed. Some refused outright to learn. Sartre denounced Solzhenitsyn as a dangerous element. Derrida, more subtle, substituted the idea of power for the idea of money and continued on his merry way. Such linguistic sleight of hand gave all the barely represented Marxists still inhabiting the intellectual pinnacles of the West the means to retain their worldview. Society was no longer repression of the poor by the rich. It was the oppression by everyone. It was the oppression of everyone by the powerful. According to Derrida, hierarchical structures emerged only to include the beneficiaries of that structure and to exclude everyone else who were therefore oppressed. Even that claim was sufficiently radical. Derrida claimed that divisiveness and oppression were built right into language, built into the very category we use to pragmatically simplify and negotiate the world. There are women only because men gain by excluding them. There are males and females only because members of that more heterogeneous group benefit by excluding the tiny minority of people whose biologically sexuality is amorphous. Science only benefits the scientists. Politics only benefit the politicians. In Derrida's view, hierarchies exist because they gain from oppressing those who are omitted. It is this ill-gotten gain that allows them to flourish. Dr. Peterson doesn't agree with this guy Derrida, just so you know. He has an opposite viewpoint. This Derrida guy is way off. Derrida famously said, although he denied it later, "Il ne passe dehors texte," often translated as "there is nothing outside the text." His supporters say that this is a mistranslation, and that in the English equivalent should have been "there is no outside text." It remains difficult. Either way, to read the statement as saying anything other than everything is interpretation, and that is how Derrida's work has generally been interpreted. It is almost impossible to overestimate the nihilistic and destructive nature of this philosophy. See, I told you he doesn't agree with it. It puts the act of categorization itself in doubt. It negates the idea that distinctions might be drawn between anything for any reason other than that of raw power. Biological distinctions between men and women, despite the existence of an overwhelming multidisciplinary scientific literature indicating that sex differences are powerfully influenced by biological factors, science is just another game of power for Derrida and his postmodern Marxist acolytes, making claims to benefit those at the pinnacle of the scientific world. There are no facts. Hierarchical position and reputation as a consequence of skill and competence. All definitions of skill and of competence are merely made up by those who benefit from them, to exclude others and to benefit personally and selfishly. Hierarchical. There is sufficient truth to Derrida's claim to account in part for their insidious nature. Power is a fundamental motivational force, A, not B. People compete to rise to the top, and they care where they are in the dominant hierarchy. But, and this is where you separate the metaphorical boys from the men, philosophically, the fact that power plays a role in human motivation does not mean that it plays the only role, or even the primary role. Likewise, the fact that we can never know everything does make our observations and utterances dependent on taking some things into account and leaving other things out, as we discussed extensively in Rule 10. This does not justify the claim that everything is interpretation, or that categorization is just exclusion. Beware of single cause interpretations, and beware of the people who purvey them. He was just basically going after his critics the last couple pages. Although the facts cannot speak for themselves, just as an expanse of land spread out before a voyager cannot tell him how to journey through it, and although there are myriad ways to interact with and even perceive even a small number of objects, that does not mean that all interpretations are equally valid. Some hurt yourself and others. Others put you on a collision course with society. Some are not sustainable across time. Others do not get you where you want to go. Many of these constraints are built into us, a consequence of billion years of evolutionary processes. Others emerge as we are socialized into cooperating and competing peacefully and productively with each other. Still, more interpretations emerge as we discuss counterproductive strategies through learning. An endless number of interpretations, certainly. That is not different from saying an endless number of problems, but a seriously bounded number of viable solutions. Otherwise, life would be easy, and it's not. Now, I have some beliefs that might be regarded as left-leaning. I think, for example, that the tendency for valuable goods to distribute themselves with pronounced inequality constitutes an ever-present threat to the stability of society. I think there is a good evidence for that. That does not mean that the solution to the problem is self-evident. We don't know how to redistribute wealth without introducing a whole host of other problems. Different Western societies have tried different approaches. The Swedes, for example, push equality to its limit. The U.S. takes the opposite tack, assuming that the net wealth creation of a more free-for-all capitalism constitutes the rising tide that lifts all boats. The results of these experiments are not all in, and countries differ very much in relevant ways. Differences in history, geography, area, population size, and ethnic diversity make direct comparisons very difficult. But certainly it is the case that forced redistribution in the name of utopian equality is a cure to shame the disease. I think as well, on that what might be considered the leftist side, that the incremental remake of university administrations into analogs of private corporations is a mistake. I think that the science of management is a pseudo discipline. I believe that government can sometimes be a force for good as well as the necessary arbitrator of a small set of necessary rules. That's definitely left thinking. Nonetheless, I do not understand why our society is providing public funding to institutions and educators whose stated, conscious, and explicit aim is the demolition of the culture that supports them. Such people have a perfect right to their opinion and actions if they remain lawful, but they have no reasonable claim to public funding. If radical right-wingers were receiving state funding for political operations disguised as university courses, as the radical left-wingers clearly are, the uproar from progressives across North America would be deafening. True, it's a double standard. He's right about that. I went to the University of Texas and I tried to take some of those courses. I basically was pushed out of them by being a Caucasian conservative male. That was it was one of the worst experiences I had. There are other serious problems lurking in the radical disciplines apart from the falseness of their theories and methods, and their instances that collective political activism is morally obligatory. There isn't a shred of hard evidence to support any of their central claims that Western society is a pathologically patriarchal, that the prime lesson of history is that men, rather than nature, were the primary source of the oppression of women, rather than, as in most cases, their partners and supporters, that all hierarchies are based on power and aimed at exclusion. Hierarchies exist for many reasons, some arguably valid, some not, and are incredibly ancient, evolutionary speaking. Do male crustaceans oppress female crustaceans? Should their hierarchies be upended? In societies that are well functioning, not in comparison to a hypothetical utopia, but contrasted with other existing or historical cultures, competence, not power, is a prime determiner of status. Competence, ability, skill, not power. This is obvious both antecedentically and factually. No one with brain cancer is equity-minded enough to refuse the service of the surgeon with the best education, the best reputation, and, perhaps, the highest earnings. Furthermore, the West valid personality trait predictors of long-term success in Western countries are intelligence, as measured with cognitive ability or IQ tests, and conscientiousness, a trait characterized by industriousness and orderliness. There are exceptions. Entrepreneurs and artists are higher in openness to experience, another cardinal personality trait that is than in consciousness. But openness is associated with verbal intelligence and creativity. Okay, so I have exceptionally high IQ. He's saying that the main factors leading to determine whether somebody will be successful is IQ and conscientiousness. And I have an incredibly high IQ, but my conscientiousness, a trait characterized by industriousness and orderliness, is not that high. And there are exceptions. Entrepreneurs and artists are higher in openness to experience. And I'm, yes, definitely higher in openness being an artist. Another cardinal personality trait than in conscientiousness. But openness is associated with verbal intelligence and creativity, so that exception is appropriate. Verbal intelligence and creativity. If you haven't been listening, I'm extremely intelligent verbally. This is a very long section. I may have to do it in two parts, but I'm not going to stop again, so I'm going to go straight through, try to finish. The predictive power of these traits, mathematically and economically speaking, is exceptionally high, among the highest in terms of power of anything ever actually measured at the highest ends of the social sciences. Well, as you can tell from this YouTube video, it's a very skilled person here with not even a microphone, so it's not always 100% accurate with intelligence and verbal ability and success. So maybe if I get a better microphone and a better camera and a better light, then his theory will prove correct. A good battery of personality cognitive tests can increase the probability of employing someone more competent than average from 50-50 to 85-15. These are the facts as well supported as anything in the social sciences, and this is saying more than you might think, as the social sciences are more effective disciplines than their critics appreciates. Thus, not only is the state supporting one-sided radicalism, it is also supporting indoctrination. We do not teach our children that the world is flat. Neither should we teach them unsupported ideological predicted theories about the nature of men and women or the nature of hierarchy. It is not unreasonable to note, if the deconstructiveness would leave it at that, that science can be biased by the interest of power and to warn against that, or to point out the evidence is too often what powerful people, including scientists, decide it is. After all, scientists are people too, and people like power, just like lobsters like power. Just like deconstructionists like to be known for their ideas and strive rightly to sit atop their academic hierarchies. But that doesn't mean that science or even deconstructionalism is only about power. Why believe such a thing? Why insist upon it? Perhaps it's this. If only power exists, then the use of power becomes fully justifiable. There is no bounding such by evidence, method, logic, or even the necessity for coherence. There is no bounding by anything outside the text that leaves opinion and force, and the use of force is all too attractive under such circumstances, just as is the employment in the service of that opinion is all too certain. The insane and incomprehensible postmodern insistence that all gender differences are socially constructed, for example, becomes all too understandable when its moral imperative is grasped, when its justification to force is once and for all understood. Society must be altered or bias eliminated until all outcomes are equitable. But the bedrock of the social constructionist position is that wish for the latter, not belief in the justice of the former. Since all outcome inequalities must be eliminated, inequality being the heart of all evil. Then all gender differences must be regarded as socially constructed. Otherwise, the drive for equality would be too radical and the doctrine too blatantly propagandistic. Thus, the order of logic is reversed so that the ideology can be camouflaged. The fact that such statements lead immediately to internal inconsistencies with the ideology is never addressed. Gender is constructed, but an individual who desires gender reassignment surgery is to be unarguably considered a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa. The fact that both of these cannot logically be true simultaneously is just ignored or rationalized away with another appalling postmodern claim that logic itself, along with the techniques of science, is merely part of the oppressive patriarchal system. It is also the case, of course, that all outcomes cannot be equalized. First, outcomes must be measured. Comparing the salaries of people who occupy the same position is relatively straightforward, although complicated significantly by such things as date of hire, given the difference in demand for workers, for example, at different time periods. But there are other dimensions of a comparison that are arguably equally relevant, such as tenure, promotion rate, and social influence. The introduction of the equal pay for equal work argument immediately complicates even salary comparison beyond practicality for one simple reason. Who decides that work is equal? It's not possible. That's why the marketplace exists. Worse is the problem of group comparison. Women should make as much as men. Okay. Black women should make as much as white women. Okay. Should salary be adjusted for all parameters of race? At what level of resolution? What racial categories are real? The U.S. National Institution of Health, to take a single bureaucratic example, recognizes American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian Black, Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, and white. But there are more than 500 separate American Indian tribes. By what possible logic should American Indian therefore stand as a chronological category? Osage's tribal members have a yearly average income of $30,000, while Tohono O'odham make $11,000. Are they equally oppressed? What about disabilities? Disabled people should make as much as non-disabled people. Okay, on the surface, that's a noble, compassionate, fair claim. But who is disabled? Is someone living with a parent with Alzheimer's disabled? If not, why not? What about someone with a lower IQ, someone less attractive, someone overweight? Some people clearly move through life overburdened with problems that are beyond their control. But it is a rare person indeed who isn't suffering from at least one serious catastrophe at any given time, particularly if you include their family in the equation. And why shouldn't you? Here's the fundamental problem. Group identity can be fractionized right down to the level of the individual. That sentence should be written in capital letters. Every person is unique, and not just in a trivial manner. Importantly, significantly, unique. Group membership cannot capture that variability, period. None of this complexity is ever discussed by the postmodern Marxist thinkers. Instead, their ideological approach fixes a point of truth, like the North Star, and forces everything to rotate around it. The claim that all gender differences are consequence of socialization is neither provable nor disprovable. In some sense, because culture can be brought to bear with such force on groups or individuals that virtually any outcome is attainable, if we are willing to bear the cost. We know, for example, from studies of adopted out identical twins, that culture can produce a 15-point or one standard deviation increase in IQ, roughly the difference between the average high school student and the average state college student, at the cost of a 3 standard deviation increase in wealth. What that means approximately is that two identical twins separated at birth will differ in IQ by 15 points if the first twin is raised in a family that is poorer than 85% of families, and the second is raised in a richer family than 95% of families. Something similar has recently been demonstrated with education rather than wealth. We don't know what it would cost in wealth or differential education to produce a more extreme transformation. What such studies imply is that we could probably minimize the innate differences between boys and girls if we were willing to exert enough pressure. This would be in no way ensure that we were freeing people of either gender to make their own choices. But choice has no place in the ideological picture. If men and women act voluntarily to produce gender unequal outcomes, those very choices must have been determined by cultural bias. In consequence, everyone is a brainwashed victim. Wherever gender differences exist, and the rigorous critical theoretician is morally obligated to set them straight. This means that those already equity-minded Scandinavian males who aren't much into nursing require even much more restraining. The same goes in principle for Scandinavian females who aren't much into engineering. What might such restraining look like? Where might its limits be? Such things are often pushed to any reasonable limit before they are discontinued. Mao's murderous cultural revolution should have taught us that. That was from Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules from Life. That was from rule number 11, don't bother children while they're skateboarding. He's comparing communism to like gender politics, and not really gender politics, but unequal outcomes and cultural bias. That's something that section he gets in a lot of trouble for out of any. That's probably the most controversial section of this book that I've read, and that's like basically he's group identity can be fractionalized right down to the level of the individual. You know, he doesn't want like he's like, yeah, a white person should make more than a black person, but an American Indian should make more than that. Like, it's like, yeah, he is talking about group politics in a way, but you can take your own interpretation of it. My name is Gregory Brand. It's really late right now here in Hawaii. It's almost midnight, and that's late for me. It's on a Sunday night, almost midnight, and I appreciate you listening. I'm really enjoying this book. My name is Gregory Brand. I just said that. If you haven't already, click the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button. I'm trying to help this channel grow, and I like doing this, and it's something that I'm willing to do for other people in the service I provide. Thanks. Have a nice day.